It was Mother's Day weekend in the quiet mountain community of Salida, Colorado. The roads were nearly empty. The air was calm. And somewhere between Saturday night and Sunday afternoon, a wife, a mother, and a friend simply disappeared. There was no goodbye, no phone call asking for help, no confirmed sighting after that weekend, just silence. At first, it seemed like a missing person case, but within days, investigators began asking a different question. What if Suzanne Morphew hadn't gone missing at all? What if someone had made sure she would never come home? As detectives searched forests, riverbanks, abandoned mines, and miles of rugged Colorado terrain, one person remained at the center of the investigation: her husband, Barry Morphew. To some, he was a desperate husband searching for his missing wife. To others, his behavior raised difficult questions that would eventually lead to one of the most controversial murder investigations in recent American history. No body, no eyewitness, no confession. Yet prosecutors believed the evidence told a different story. And years later, the mystery surrounding Suzanne Morphew continues to spark debate across the country. This is the story of Suzanne Morphew. Before Suzanne became the subject of national headlines, she was known simply as a devoted mother and friend. Born Suzanne Mormon, she grew up in Indiana, where family and faith played an important role in her life. Friends often described her as caring, energetic, and someone who loved the outdoors. She enjoyed nature, fitness, and spending time with the people she loved. During her younger years, she met Barry Morphew. The relationship quickly grew serious. They married and eventually built a life together that, from the outside, appeared successful. Barry worked in landscaping and construction. Over the years, the couple built businesses together and raised 2 daughters. To neighbors and acquaintances, they often appeared to have achieved the American dream: a successful business, a beautiful home, financial stability, children preparing for adulthood. But appearances can sometimes hide problems invisible to everyone else. In 2018, the Morphew family made a significant decision. They left Indiana behind and moved west to Colorado. Their new home sat near Salida, surrounded by breathtaking mountain views, forests, rivers, and hiking trails. It was exactly the type of place many people dream about living. Peaceful, private, remote, Barry continued working in construction projects throughout the area. Suzanne settled into life in Colorado while remaining close with friends and relatives back in Indiana. Although the move looked exciting from the outside, it also placed Suzanne farther away from many of the people who had known her for years. That distance would later become important, because when investigators began interviewing friends, they learned details about Suzanne's life that many people in Colorado never knew. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Suzanne was quietly fighting another battle. Years earlier, she had been diagnosed with cancer. She underwent treatment and fought hard to recover. Family members admired her strength. She eventually reached remission. But surviving cancer often changes a person's outlook on life. According to people who knew her, Suzanne began thinking more deeply about happiness, relationships, and what she wanted from the future. Investigators would later discover messages suggesting that her marriage was experiencing serious difficulties. Those discoveries would become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. As Mother's Day weekend approached in May 2020, the Morphew household appeared unusually quiet. Their daughters were away on a camping trip. Suzanne was reportedly spending the weekend at home. Barry said he planned to leave early Sunday morning for a construction job in another city. Nothing about the weekend initially seemed unusual, until Sunday afternoon. When relatives could not reach Suzanne, concern quickly grew. Her bicycle was later discovered off a nearby road. Not long afterward, her helmet was found in a separate location. At first glance, it looked possible she had been involved in some kind of accident while riding. But experienced investigators noticed something troubling. There was very little evidence of a crash. No significant damage to the bicycle consistent with a high-speed collision. No obvious signs explaining where Suzanne had gone. It was almost as though the bicycle had simply been left there. As news spread across Colorado, volunteers gathered to search. Neighbors, friends, law enforcement, search and rescue teams. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs searched the woods. Drones scanned difficult terrain. Everyone hoped Suzanne would be found alive. Barry Morphew appeared publicly, pleading for his wife's safe return. His emotional video asking Suzanne to come home quickly circulated across television and social media. For many viewers, it looked like the heartfelt appeal of a worried husband. But investigators were already beginning to reconstruct the final hours before Suzanne disappeared. Cell phone data, vehicle movements, security cameras, digital communications. Every minute mattered. Every electronic device became potential evidence. Every statement would later be compared against the timeline investigators were building. And before long, detectives began noticing details that, in their view, did not fit together. The search for a missing woman was slowly becoming something much larger, much more complicated, and much more controversial, because behind the peaceful scenery of the Colorado mountains, investigators believed a hidden story was beginning to emerge. One built not on eyewitnesses, but on technology, on digital footprints, on deleted messages, on changing explanations, and on a timeline that prosecutors would later argue pointed toward one conclusion. But before detectives could accuse anyone, they first needed to understand what was happening inside the Morphew marriage during the weeks before Suzanne vanished. And what they uncovered would change the direction of the investigation forever. As investigators searched the mountains surrounding Salida, Colorado, another team focused on something far less visible: Suzanne Morphew's digital life, her phone, her emails, her text messages, her social media accounts, and the people she trusted enough to confide in. What they discovered painted a picture very different from the happy marriage many people believed existed. For years, friends had seen Barry and Suzanne as a successful couple. They had built businesses together, raised 2 daughters, moved to a beautiful home in Colorado. But behind closed doors, according to investigators, the relationship had been steadily falling apart. One of the first things detectives did was interview Suzanne's closest friends. These weren't casual acquaintances. These were people she had known for years, people she spoke to regularly, people who understood what was happening in her personal life. Several friends told investigators that Suzanne had become increasingly unhappy in her marriage. According to court documents, she had confided that she felt emotionally exhausted and wanted something different from her future. Investigators would later recover text messages that suggested Suzanne was considering ending the marriage. For Barry, that possibility could have meant dramatic changes: a divorce, financial consequences, the public collapse of the life they had built together. Whether those concerns influenced anyone's actions would later become a central issue in the case. Then investigators uncovered another secret. Suzanne had reconnected with someone from her past. His name was Jeff Liebler. The two had known each other decades earlier in Indiana. Over time, their conversations became more frequent. Eventually, they developed what both later acknowledged was an emotional relationship that became romantic. The relationship was conducted privately through text messages and communication apps. According to investigators, Suzanne told Jeff she was deeply unhappy in her marriage. The messages recovered from her phone revealed discussions about a future together. The conversations were personal, hopeful, and sometimes emotional. For detectives, these messages helped establish Suzanne's state of mind in the weeks before she disappeared. Rather than suggesting someone preparing to leave voluntarily without explanation, prosecutors argued the messages showed someone looking toward a different future. One message would later receive enormous public attention. In a text to Barry, Suzanne reportedly wrote words that investigators believed reflected the seriousness of the situation. She expressed that she was done. She wanted peace. She no longer wanted to continue living the way they had been. To prosecutors, the message suggested a marriage nearing its breaking point. Barry's defense, however, argued that troubled marriages are common and do not prove murder. That disagreement would remain at the center of the legal battle. Investigators also examined Barry Morphew's actions during the same period. Friends described Barry as hardworking and determined. He operated landscaping and construction businesses and was known for spending long hours on job sites. But detectives weren't simply interested in Barry's personality. They wanted to reconstruct his movements during Mother's Day weekend. Every phone call, every vehicle trip, every stop, every electronic signal. Modern criminal investigations rarely rely on a single piece of evidence. Instead, investigators build timelines using technology. Cell phone records, vehicle telematics, GPS information, security cameras, digital transactions. Each source tells part of the story. Together, they can reveal patterns that are difficult to ignore. Detectives learned that Barry had traveled to Broomfield, Colorado for a construction project on Mother's Day. According to Barry, he left home early that morning. He later maintained that Suzanne was still at the house when he departed, but investigators wanted to verify every detail independently. They reviewed surveillance footage, hotel records, electronic data from Barry's truck, phone activity. Nothing would be accepted at face value. Every statement had to match the evidence. Meanwhile, the search for Suzanne intensified. Volunteers searched forests. Investigators examined rivers. Mounted search teams covered difficult terrain. Divers inspected bodies of water. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Still, there was no sign of Suzanne, no confirmed sighting, no ransom demand, no communication, no evidence she had chosen to disappear voluntarily. As time passed, many investigators began treating the case less like a missing person investigation and more like a homicide inquiry. One of the biggest challenges facing detectives was the absence of a body. Without one, proving exactly what happened would become much more difficult. There was no autopsy, no official cause of death, no crime scene that clearly explained the events of that weekend. Instead, investigators would need to rely almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Contrary to what television dramas often suggest, circumstantial evidence can be powerful when many independent facts point toward the same conclusion, but it also requires careful interpretation. Every fact must be examined, every assumption challenged, every alternative explanation considered. As forensic specialists continued analyzing electronic evidence, they noticed activity that investigators believed deserved closer attention. Vehicle movements, phone connections, changes in digital activity. Some events appeared unusual when compared with Barry's typical daily routine. Detectives spent months reviewing those records. They weren't looking for one dramatic clue, they were looking for consistency. Or inconsistency. Because in complex investigations, it's often the smallest details that reveal the biggest story. By late 2020, investigators believed they had assembled a timeline that raised serious questions, but they still faced a major obstacle. Questions are not enough to file a murder charge. They needed evidence strong enough to convince prosecutors that a jury could reasonably conclude a crime had occurred. That evidence, investigators believed, would eventually come from an unexpected source. Not a witness, not a confession, not a hidden camera, but from technology inside Barry Morphew's own vehicle. Data that prosecutors later argued revealed movements inconsistent with his explanation of Mother's Day weekend. Whether that data truly proved anything or could be explained another way would become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of the entire case, and it would eventually place Barry Morphew under intense public scrutiny. If you've watched enough true crime cases, you've probably noticed one pattern. Murder investigations are rarely solved by one dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, they're solved by timelines, minute by minute, second by second, Who was where? Who called whom? What devices were active? What vehicles were moving? And perhaps the most important question of all, does the evidence match the story? For investigators working the Suzanne Morphew case, that question became their entire focus. Barry Morphew told investigators that he left the family home early on the morning of May 10, 2020. It was Mother's Day. He said he was traveling nearly 150 miles to Broomfield, Colorado, where he had planned to work on a landscaping project. On its face, nothing seemed unusual. Construction workers often travel long distances. Early morning departures weren't uncommon, but detectives wanted to know exactly when Barry left, exactly where he stopped, and exactly what his electronic devices recorded during the trip. Because unlike people, technology doesn't forget. Investigators obtained data from Barry's truck. Modern pickup trucks store an incredible amount of information. Doors opening and closing, vehicle movements, engine activity, location data. Even seemingly routine actions can become important when investigators compare them to other evidence. As analysts reviewed the truck's data, prosecutors later argued that Barry's movements during the early morning hours appeared unusual. The defense strongly disputed that interpretation, arguing there were innocent explanations for the activity. This disagreement would later become one of the most contested issues in the case. Detectives also examined Barry's cell phone. Cell phones constantly communicate with nearby towers. They log activity, record movement, track application usage, even when someone isn't actively making calls or sending messages. According to prosecutors, Barry's phone activity during critical periods differed from what they expected based on his account of the morning. The defense argued that cell phone evidence is not always precise and warned against drawing firm conclusions from digital records alone. Both sides would spend months debating exactly what the technology did and did not prove. Meanwhile, investigators continued looking at Suzanne's final known communications. She had exchanged messages with Jeff Liebler during the days leading up to Mother's Day. Those conversations suddenly stopped, not gradually, not over several days, abruptly. To detectives, that abrupt silence stood out. People ending relationships often leave traces. A final message, a goodbye, a missed call. In Suzanne's case, there was nothing. It was as though her digital life simply ended. Then investigators turned their attention back to the family home. Although they never publicly identified a traditional crime scene in the way viewers often see on television, they searched the property extensively. Forensic teams photographed rooms, collected samples, examined vehicles, looked for biological evidence, searched electronic devices. Every item was cataloged, every potential clue documented. The goal wasn't to prove a theory. It was to determine whether the evidence supported or contradicted the timeline investigators were building. Outside the home, search teams faced an almost impossible challenge. The Colorado wilderness surrounding Salida stretches for miles. Dense forests, rocky hillsides, rivers, abandoned mine shafts, remote trails, thousands of acres where someone could disappear. Helicopters scanned from above. Search and rescue teams walked difficult terrain. Cadaver dogs searched locations investigators considered significant. Volunteers gave up weekends hoping to bring Suzanne home. Every search ended the same way. No Suzanne. No bicycle rider. No evidence that she had simply become lost. Only more questions. As public interest grew, national news outlets began covering the case almost daily. Television analysts debated the evidence. Former detectives offered opinions. Social media exploded with theories. Some believed Barry was being unfairly judged in the court of public opinion. Others believed investigators already knew exactly what had happened. The challenge for law enforcement was separating speculation from evidence. Public opinion cannot solve a case. Facts can. Months passed. Investigators interviewed neighbors, co-workers, friends, and family members. They executed search warrants, collected electronic records, reviewed surveillance footage, compared timelines. Gradually, they believed a clearer picture was emerging, one that focused less on what happened after Suzanne disappeared and more on what investigators believed happened before anyone realized she was missing. Then another development shifted the investigation. Prosecutors later alleged that Barry had disposed of items at multiple trash locations while traveling on Mother's Day. The defense challenged the significance of those stops, arguing they were consistent with routine work activities. Once again, the same evidence produced two completely different interpretations, and that would become a defining feature of the entire case. Every movement, every electronic record, every statement. The prosecution and defense saw them through completely different lenses. Nearly a year after Suzanne disappeared, investigators believed they had enough evidence to take the next step. It was one of the most anticipated moments in the investigation. After months of searching, countless interviews, and thousands of hours analyzing digital evidence, Barry Morphew was arrested. The announcement shocked Colorado. Some believed justice was finally beginning. Others believed prosecutors were moving too quickly in a case without a body. What happened next would become one of the most controversial legal battles in recent true crime history. Because the arrest was only the beginning. On May 5, 2021, just days before the first anniversary of Suzanne Morphew's disappearance, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation announced a major breakthrough. Barry Morphew had been arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder after deliberation, attempting to influence a public servant, and tampering with physical evidence. For nearly a year, investigators had worked almost entirely without what many people consider the most important piece of evidence in a homicide investigation. Suzanne herself. Her body had not been found. There was no autopsy, no official cause of death. Yet prosecutors believed the evidence they had gathered was enough to move forward. The announcement made national headlines. Many people believed the mystery had finally been solved, but the legal battle was only beginning. Following the arrest, prosecutors released a lengthy arrest affidavit that outlined their theory of the case. According to investigators, Suzanne had been planning to leave her marriage. They pointed to text messages, conversations with friends, and her relationship with Jeff Liebler as evidence that the marriage was reaching a breaking point. Prosecutors argued that Barry knew his wife wanted out. They alleged that this created a powerful motive. The defense strongly disagreed. Barry's attorneys argued that marital problems do not prove murder and that the prosecution's case relied heavily on assumptions rather than direct evidence. From the very beginning, both sides told very different stories. Prosecutors also focused on Barry's actions during Mother's Day weekend. They highlighted his early morning trip to Broomfield and argued that his movements, phone activity, and vehicle data did not align with his explanation of events. Investigators pointed to electronic records they believed showed unusual activity. The defense responded that digital data can be incomplete or misunderstood, and that innocent explanations existed for many of the observations. This became a recurring theme throughout the case. The same evidence, two completely different interpretations. Another major point of discussion involved Barry's interviews with investigators. Over the course of the investigation, he spoke with law enforcement on multiple occasions. Prosecutors later argued that some of his statements changed over time or conflicted with other evidence. The defense countered that people under stress do not always remember every detail consistently, especially after the sudden disappearance of a loved one. Jurors in criminal trials are often asked to evaluate credibility, but in this case, there would be no jury, at least not yet. The legal fight unfolded through hearings, motions, and arguments over what evidence should be allowed at trial. As the case progressed, prosecutors continued searching for Suzanne. Despite the arrest, investigators had not stopped looking for her. Search teams returned to areas of interest. They followed new tips from the public. Each new lead carried the possibility that the case could change dramatically if Suzanne's remains were found. But month after month, the searches came up empty. Without Suzanne, prosecutors faced an enormous challenge. They needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder had occurred, even though the victim had not been recovered. No body homicide cases are possible, but they are among the most difficult cases prosecutors ever bring. Then, cracks began to appear in the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys challenged several aspects of the investigation. They argued that investigators had failed to preserve certain evidence, relied too heavily on speculation, and had not fully explored alternative explanations. Pre-trial hearings became increasingly contentious. Judges reviewed motions. Witnesses were questioned. Experts debated the meaning of digital evidence. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward march toward trial was becoming far more complicated. In April 2022, a dramatic development stunned everyone following the case. The district attorney's office asked the court to dismiss the murder charge against Barry Morphew without prejudice. A dismissal without prejudice means prosecutors may bring the charge again in the future if they obtain additional evidence. The court granted the request. Barry Morphew was released. For many people, the decision was confusing. Had prosecutors concluded Barry was innocent? The dismissal did not declare him innocent, nor did it resolve the case. Instead, prosecutors explained that they wanted more time to continue investigating after disputes over evidence and witness issues affected the path toward trial. Barry, through his attorneys, continued to maintain that he had nothing to do with Suzanne's disappearance. The dismissal reignited public debate. Some believed the prosecution had moved too quickly by filing charges before the investigation was complete. Others believed the evidence still strongly pointed toward Barry and that investigators simply needed more time. The case that had once seemed close to trial was now back in an investigative phase. For Suzanne's family, it was another painful delay. They still had no answers, no body, no grave to visit, and no final resolution. Then, more than 3 years after Suzanne disappeared, investigators made another major announcement. During a search in a remote area of Colorado, human remains were discovered. The remains were later identified as Suzanne Morphew. For the first time since Mother's Day weekend in 2020, investigators finally had the evidence they had been searching for. The discovery transformed the investigation. Medical examiners began the difficult process of determining how Suzanne died. Forensic testing was conducted on the remains and surrounding evidence. Once again, the case moved into a new chapter, one that investigators hoped would finally answer questions that had remained unresolved for years. For more than 3 years, Suzanne Morphew remained missing. Search teams had combed forests. Divers searched rivers. Investigators followed hundreds of leads. Volunteers spent countless hours looking for any clue that might bring Suzanne home. Every search ended the same way. Nothing. As time passed, many people began to wonder whether Suzanne would ever be found. Then, in September 2023, everything changed. On September 22, 2023, investigators searching a remote area near Moffett, Colorado, discovered human remains. The location was more than 40 miles south of the Morphew family home. It wasn't an area where investigators had focused their earliest searches. At first, authorities revealed very little. The scene was secured. Forensic specialists carefully documented everything before removing the remains for examination. These investigations move slowly for a reason. Every detail matters. A misplaced item, an overlooked fragment, a missed photograph, could later become critical evidence in court. Days later, authorities confirmed what Suzanne's family had feared for more than 3 years. The remains belonged to Suzanne Morphew. The search that had begun on Mother's Day in 2020 was finally over. But another investigation, one involving forensic science, was just beginning. For Suzanne's loved ones, the announcement brought conflicting emotions. There was profound grief. The hope of finding her alive had ended. But there was also relief. After years of uncertainty, they finally knew where Suzanne had been. Families of missing persons often describe uncertainty as its own kind of suffering. Without answers, life feels suspended. Finding a loved one cannot erase that pain, but it can begin a different kind of healing. Medical examiners carefully analyzed Suzanne's remains. Because so much time had passed, determining exactly how she died presented enormous challenges. Yet forensic science has advanced significantly over the years. Even after long periods of time, investigators can sometimes identify evidence that would once have been impossible to recover. During the examination, forensic toxicology testing revealed something unexpected. Authorities later announced that Suzanne's remains contained evidence of a combination of sedative drugs commonly used to immobilize large animals, including BAM, a mixture of butorphanol, azaparone, and medetomidine. This finding immediately drew investigators' attention. Why? Because Barry Morphew had experience using tranquilizer equipment in his work with wildlife and deer on previous occasions. Prosecutors would later argue that this forensic finding was highly significant. Barry's defense has denied wrongdoing and continues to dispute the prosecution's conclusions. As with earlier stages of the case, the evidence remains the subject of ongoing legal proceedings. The discovery of Suzanne's remains dramatically changed the investigation. For the first time, investigators were no longer building a case around a missing person. They were investigating a confirmed homicide. The El Paso County coroner ultimately ruled Suzanne's death a homicide. That determination did not identify who was responsible. Instead, it established that the manner of death resulted from the actions of another person. For prosecutors, this resolved one of the biggest challenges they had faced after Barry's first arrest. They no longer had to convince a jury that Suzanne had likely been killed despite the absence of a body. Now, they had Suzanne, and they had new forensic evidence. As news spread across the country, public interest in the case surged once again. Many people remembered Barry Morphew's arrest in 2021. Others remembered when the charges had been dismissed before trial. Now a new question emerged. Would prosecutors file charges again? Legal experts quickly explained that because the original murder charge had been dismissed without prejudice, prosecutors retained the option of bringing a new case if additional evidence supported it. The discovery of Suzanne's remains represented exactly the type of development that could significantly reshape an investigation. Meanwhile, investigators continued reviewing evidence collected over the previous 3 years. Nothing was viewed in isolation. The remains, digital evidence, vehicle data, phone records, witness interviews, search warrant findings. Every piece had to be reconsidered in light of the new forensic discoveries. Cases often evolve this way. A clue that seemed unimportant years earlier may suddenly become meaningful when viewed alongside newly discovered evidence. Investigators repeatedly returned to the timeline they had constructed. Did the new findings support it? Did they challenge it? Or did they point in an entirely different direction? For Suzanne's daughters, the discovery marked another painful chapter. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. Now, they faced a different reality. Their mother would not be coming home. Throughout the investigation, the family has experienced the case in ways the public never could. While millions followed headlines and court filings, they carried the personal weight of losing someone they loved. That human cost is easy to forget when cases become national news. Behind every headline is a family trying to rebuild a life that will never be the same. Then came another dramatic development. Armed with the new forensic findings and years of investigative work, prosecutors once again presented their evidence. This time, the legal landscape looked very different. The discovery of Suzanne's remains had answered one question, but it raised many others. Would investigators now be able to prove exactly what happened during Mother's Day weekend in 2020? Would a jury finally hear the evidence that had never been presented after Barry's first arrest? And could one of America's most closely watched missing person cases finally reach the courtroom? Those questions would soon be answered. When Suzanne Morphew disappeared in May 2020, investigators believed they were dealing with a murder. When Barry Morphew was arrested in 2021, many thought a trial was just around the corner, but the charges were dismissed before a jury ever heard the evidence. For a time, it seemed possible that the case might never reach a courtroom. Then, the discovery of Suzanne's remains changed everything. The investigation entered an entirely new phase, and prosecutors once again began preparing for what they believed could finally become the trial the public had waited years to see. Finding Suzanne's remains answered one question: where she was. But it also opened the door to many new ones. How had she died? Could forensic testing reveal something investigators had missed? Would the physical evidence support or challenge the prosecution's original theory? Medical examiners and forensic scientists spent months analyzing every available piece of evidence. Unlike television dramas, this work is rarely fast. Every laboratory result must be verified, every finding documented, every conclusion reviewed. Because once a criminal case reaches court, every detail will be examined by both sides. As investigators reviewed old evidence alongside the new forensic findings, they also revisited interviews conducted years earlier. Witness statements, phone records, vehicle data, digital activity. Nothing was taken for granted. Sometimes, evidence that appears insignificant during the early stages of an investigation becomes much more important after new discoveries are made. Investigators compared every timeline once again. Every movement, every phone call, every electronic record. The goal wasn't simply to confirm their earlier conclusions. It was to test them. If the new evidence contradicted the original theory, they needed to know. If it strengthened the theory, they needed to understand how. Throughout this process, Barry Morphew continued to maintain his innocence. Through his attorneys, he denied killing Suzanne. The defense consistently argued that the investigation focused too narrowly on Barry, while overlooking other possibilities. Defense lawyers also challenged aspects of the forensic evidence and questioned whether prosecutors could prove exactly how Suzanne died or who was responsible. In the American legal system, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That principle remained just as important in Suzanne's case as it is in every criminal prosecution. One of the reasons this investigation has attracted so much attention is because it highlights the challenges of building a homicide case based largely on circumstantial evidence. Contrary to popular belief, circumstantial evidence is not weaker simply because it is indirect. In fact, many murder convictions rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. The key question is whether all of the evidence, viewed together, supports one reasonable conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the question prosecutors hoped a future jury would eventually answer. By this point, the public had followed the investigation for more than 3 years. Every development generated national headlines. Television networks covered court hearings. Legal analysts debated the evidence. True crime podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the case. Social media discussions often became heated. Some believed investigators had assembled a compelling case. Others believed too many unanswered questions remained. The challenge for the justice system was not to satisfy public opinion. It was to determine what could actually be proven in court. Meanwhile, Suzanne's family continued living with the consequences of that Mother's Day weekend. For them, every legal development carried emotional weight. The discovery of Suzanne's remains ended years of uncertainty, but it did not erase the grief, nor did it answer every question. Families often describe homicide investigations as emotional marathons rather than sprints. Every hearing, every news conference, every court filing forces them to relive the events all over again. While the public moves from one headline to the next, families remain connected to the case every single day. The Suzanne Morphew investigation also sparked broader conversations about domestic relationships and hidden conflict. Friends later described Suzanne as someone who had been looking toward a different future. Investigators recovered messages suggesting she wanted significant changes in her life. Those details became part of the prosecution's theory regarding motive. The defense argued that relationship problems, even serious ones, do not establish guilt. Both points can be true. People experience marital conflict every day without violence. That is why prosecutors must prove much more than motive alone. They must connect evidence directly to the alleged crime. As legal preparations continued, one fact remained impossible to ignore. This case had already taken unexpected turns before. Charges had been filed. Charges had been dismissed. New evidence had been discovered years later. Investigators had spent thousands of hours rebuilding the timeline. No one involved underestimated how difficult the next stage would be. The decisions made by prosecutors, and eventually by a jury, if the case reached trial, would be closely watched across the country. But before any final legal resolution could occur, another major announcement reshaped the future of the investigation. Years after Suzanne disappeared, prosecutors returned to court with renewed confidence, arguing that the newly discovered forensic evidence strengthened their case. Whether that evidence would ultimately convince a jury remained an open question. And that brings us to the final chapter of this story, a chapter about justice, about unanswered questions, and about why the Suzanne Morphew case continues to fascinate millions of people years after one ordinary Mother's Day changed everything forever. Every criminal investigation reaches a point where the search for answers becomes something more. It becomes a search for justice. For Suzanne Morphew's family, that search has lasted years. It has survived changing court dates, thousands of pages of evidence, countless media reports, and one of the most closely watched homicide investigations in modern Colorado history. Yet even today, many questions remain unanswered. Not because investigators stopped searching, but because proving a murder case in court requires much more than suspicion. It requires evidence that convinces a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. The Suzanne Morphew investigation reminds us that real life rarely follows the neat structure of television crime dramas. There isn't always one piece of evidence that solves everything. There isn't always a dramatic confession. Sometimes, the truth must be assembled from hundreds of separate details: phone records, vehicle data, witness statements, digital communications, forensic testing. Each piece tells only part of the story. Together, investigators hope they reveal what happened. One of the reasons this case continues to generate public interest is because it changed so dramatically over time. First, Suzanne was reported missing. Then, investigators announced they believed she had been murdered. Barry Morphew was arrested. The charges were dismissed before trial. Years later, Suzanne's remains were discovered. New forensic evidence emerged. The investigation entered another phase. Few modern homicide investigations have experienced so many unexpected turns. Every new development forced investigators to reevaluate earlier conclusions. Every new piece of evidence had to be compared against everything that came before it. For Suzanne's daughters, the legal process has unfolded in full public view. Every court hearing became a headline. Every motion was discussed on television. Every new development sparked debate online. While millions followed the investigation through news reports, they experienced it as something deeply personal: the loss of a mother, the uncertainty of years without answers, and the emotional weight of seeing a family tragedy become national news. It's easy to become absorbed in the mystery, the evidence, the legal arguments, the forensic science. But at the center of every homicide investigation is a family learning how to live with an absence that cannot be replaced. The case has also become a reminder of how much criminal investigations have changed. Today, investigators don't rely solely on eyewitnesses. They reconstruct lives through technology. Phones record movements. Vehicles store data. Security cameras capture moments people don't realize are being recorded. Fitness trackers, messaging apps, cloud backups, smart devices. Each leaves behind pieces of information that investigators can analyze. Sometimes those records confirm a person's account. Sometimes they raise new questions. In Suzanne's case, digital evidence became one of the central pillars of the investigation. The discovery of Suzanne's remains also highlighted the remarkable advances in forensic science. Years after her disappearance, investigators were still able to conduct meaningful testing. Modern forensic laboratories can recover information that would have been impossible to detect decades ago. That scientific progress continues to reshape criminal investigations around the world. Cold cases once believed unsolvable are now being reopened. Families who waited decades for answers are finally receiving them. Technology cannot solve every mystery, but it has transformed the pursuit of justice. Perhaps the most important lesson from Suzanne's case is patience. The public often expects immediate answers. Investigators rarely have that luxury. Every search warrant, every interview, every forensic report, every laboratory result must withstand scrutiny in court. A rushed investigation can jeopardize an entire prosecution. That's why complex homicide cases sometimes take years before they reach trial. Justice delayed can be frustrating. But investigators know that justice rushed can fail completely. As this documentary is being produced, the legal process surrounding Suzanne Morphew's death continues to evolve. Court proceedings, evidence reviews, and legal filings may continue after this video's publication. That is one reason it's important to distinguish between verified facts presented in court records and speculations circulating online. True crime should seek understanding, not rumors, not assumptions, not entertainment at the expense of real families. The facts are compelling enough on their own. Today, when people search for Suzanne Morphew's name, they often begin with a simple question: what really happened? Investigators believe they know. The defense disputes that conclusion. Ultimately, the legal system exists to evaluate evidence through a fair judicial process. Whatever the final outcome may be, Suzanne's story has already changed the way many people think about missing person investigations, forensic science, and the role technology now plays in modern criminal cases. But perhaps the greatest legacy Suzanne leaves behind isn't found in court documents, or forensic reports, or television interviews. It's found in the memories shared by those who knew her. A mother who loved her daughters, a woman who survived cancer, a friend remembered for her kindness, someone whose life cannot be reduced to the circumstances of her disappearance. Because before the headlines, before the investigations, before the courtroom arguments, Suzanne Morphew was simply a person living her life. And that is how those who loved her hope she will always be remembered. If you found this documentary informative and appreciate carefully researched true crime stories that focus on verified evidence rather than speculation, consider subscribing to the channel. Each week, we explore real criminal investigations from around the world, examining the facts, the evidence, and the pursuit of justice while remembering the victims at the center of every story. If there's a case you'd like to see covered next, let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop asking questions.